All right. Well, good day, Chairmen. We are a Chairman down today with Grant on holiday, but luckily to fill the shoes of the great Grant Klassen, we have the incomparable Lyle Caldwell as well as Brian Omilion. And if you're not familiar with Lyle's work, he goes by Psionic Audio on YouTube. And I would say, without a doubt, is my favorite amplifier technician to watch on YouTube. And you know, sometimes my wife will come by when I'm watching, you know, some of these things on our television, and you know, I think that it's like watching those like slow trains from, you know, in Norway going to different cities. I think that she thinks it's about the same equivalency of just watching, you know, trains go through multiple stations on an 8-hour trip, as I'm watching Lyle, you know, desolder capacitors and replace components on a PC board. But man, such a treat to have you, Lyle, and you're just so knowledgeable about not only the inner workings of the amplifiers that we know and love, but also have a tremendous amount of experience in understanding what a customer should be looking for in a potential amplifier choice. And I really want to spend the lion's share of our time today going through your recommendations at different price points for amplifiers, because this is always a question that people ask: is what is the best bang for my buck if I'm going to spend $500, $1,000, $2,000 or more on an amplifier? What's actually great? Because sometimes we're thrown off by name brands and sort of the legacy of certain brands, and then believing that that means that the amp equals quality. That's compounded even further by things that we've talked about on the show, where we'll see major magazine publications talk about their recommendations, and some of them are just bolstered by advertising dollars, and they're not actually rooted in anything that has to do with the quality of the amp, and a lot of those editors don't know anything about servicing amplifiers, so they can't speak to the qualities of that. So long-winded intro. Thank you, Lyle, for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's very nice to be here.
Yeah. So I think maybe where we'll start is you and I were texting offline earlier this week, and we were looking through some of the publications from like Music Radar and Guitar Player magazine, and they would put these lists of like top 10 amplifiers, and you know, there were some picks in there that, you know, I think were okay, but for the most part, these are things like the Boss Katana, the Positive Grid, the Orange kind of Tiny Terror, the Hot Rod Deluxe, and you know, then they'd kind of have some higher end stuff like the Tone King Imperial or the Friedman. But for the most part, the majority of their recommendations are sort of a mix of solid state, some tube, but Supro amps, which I know you love, joking there, and so if we were to, let's say, create Lyle's list of, let's say, you know, top 5 or top 10 amplifiers in, let's say, a low price point like 500. Where would you start, and maybe what are some of the problems with these lists and some of these products that we see, you know, typically recommended by the big magazine and online publications?
Well, the number one problem that I see is that the people doing the reviews aren't qualified to review an amplifier as far as all the things you need to consider with an amplifier. They never open it up and see how it's built and say, hey, they did this, that's good, or they did this, that may be problematic later. It's never gut shots or any explanation of the circuit. It's a guy playing it, getting some good sounds, maybe noting that, hey, okay, it's a little bit of a noise, but most people are used to that. And then a whole bunch of paraphrased copy from the manufacturer, and that's what it is, and with great big pictures. And it's being presented as a full review. It'd be like if I reviewed a Fender Strat without plugging it in. It looks cool. It's got 3 of these things and a thing that goes wee wee wee. But okay, it won't hold its tune. The body was made with wet wood. All your strings, your screws are going to rust out. Things that a guitar tech would say, hey, that's not a good one. The other thing is there is bias towards certain companies and bias against certain mindsets. So there are companies, Vox, Fender, Marshall, that can rightfully be accused at times of trading off the heritage of their logo. And there are people who are anti-modeling or anti-solid state because tubes rule, man. And there are the guys who are like, okay, boomer, whatever. I'm just going to go get a line 6. And any of these categories can have a great result or a bad result. I did an Amps Under $500 video without recapping the entire thing. It came down to 3 recommendations, really. If you are playing a gig and you need a lot of flexibility and you don't want to spend a lot, the Marshall DSL-40C and CR are pretty good choices. You can get $900 used, $1,100 new. They got a good clean. They got really good overdrive. They have a useful effects loop. They have a passable digital reverb. They're not fantastic, but they cover a lot of bases if you want to. If you want to have the same flexibility without spending as much, the Katana and the Catalyst from Line 6 do a pretty good job for a lot of people, whether that's the Katana or the Katana Artist, whatever. I thought that was also a really good choice for people if they know what they're getting, that, you know, this thing is not built as well. It's not going to be around 20 years. It's going to be obsolete in 5 years, even if it's still working, because the nature of digital stuff. So if you can say, oh, it's a $500 amp, I'll get 3 to 5 years out of it, that's less than we pay for Netflix. That's a fine expectation. If you go into it expecting, this is the amp of my dreams, that's not what that is. Neither is that Marshall. In that same price range, I love the Vox AC30 C1, the custom. You can get a used C1 with a greenback for about $600-700, maybe even $500 sometimes. That is the least flexible as far as effects and channels and switching and stuff. It is a really good sounding amp. It is really well built for the price point. It is better built at that price point than most of its competition. And it's an amp that if you're a real player, you won't outgrow. It's like having a deluxe reverb.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't do what a Marshall does. It does what a deluxe reverb does. The AC15 does what that does, and it does it really well. And even if you later had a Friedman, even if you later had a Tone King, that AC15 would have a different spot in your arsenal. And for $500, that's twice as much as what you pay for Netflix, but you get a lot more. The problem I had in that price range was all the things like the Hot Rod Deluxe. You get a used Hot Rod Deluxe, $800. They're built so poorly, they catch on fire. This is not some opinion thing. I'm not inventing this. I'm saying, as someone who does circuitry, you cannot have 15 plus minus 15, 16 volt power supplies using 5-watt Zehners and 5-watt resistors mounted right up against the PCB with no airflow. They burn, and they always burn. Every single one of them has either burned fully, or you can see the singeing beginning. And once that happens, that area of the board is gone. And once that power supply goes, your effects loop gets weird, your reverb gets weird, everything gets noisy, you get crackle, and then literal fire. And this is because they inherited a really cheap solution to the problem in 1990, and they've not fixed that glaring problem in the last 30 years. They have the Hot Rod 1, the Hot Rod 2, the Hot Rod 3, the Hot Rod 4. It's all cosmetic changes on the outside. It's what color the Tolex is, or whether it's chrome or black on the plate. But the inside, it has this same ticking time bomb, and then it costs a guy $300 to get that fixed if it's fixable. I don't like that. Also, I'm not a big fan of the Tone Masters, but that's a longer subject.
Right. Yeah. Well, it seemed like those were definitely marketed for weight more than anything.
Well, real fast on the Tone Master. It is marketing a digital amp to people who don't want digital amps. So it looks like an old Fender, and it has that visual vibe. And for clean stuff, it sounds quite nice. If you push it, it falls apart. It doesn't sound like a real Fender, the model it's modeling. But the cleans are beautiful and has a really great sounding reverb. It's very convenient, but it's just that one sound. There's no presets. There's no effects loop. There's none of the things people want from digital. You can't really hook up to a computer except for the IR out. That's kind of nice. So for those who want digital, it doesn't do everything that guys who want digital do. Those who want analog, it's not quite there. It's a weird compromise. Really nice cabinet for, I think, a well-programmed Katana would get that same sound and a whole bunch of others and cost less. It won't look like the Fender, but it has the USB out. It has the, a lot more flexibility that someone who would say, okay, Boomer, I'm going to go digital would be into and that could be the Katana, that could be the higher end Boss digital stuff. We're not even looking at all the high end stuff, the Fractal, the Kempers and stuff. That's an entire different price point. But under 1,000, under 500, people are like, oh, should I get that Fender thing? It's not quite any one great thing.
Mm-hmm. And so if you were saying to somebody, you mentioned like under 1,000, you talk about the Marshall, the Vox, and the Vox is actually a pretty decent pedal platform. So if you're using pedals, you can certainly make it more versatile in that you can, choose different flavors of distortion and overdrive and things like that to kind of give it maybe more of a Marshall-esque style clipping, or maybe a little bit more of like, I don't know, a Dumble-y, smoother clipping. Obviously, you're working within the confines of whatever the existing EQ section and everything that goes on in that amp, but I still think it's a totally reasonable pedal platform at that price point. I agree completely with that.
Yeah, I mean, I wish there was more stuff out there. And it used to be that I could say, oh, get a Princeton Reverb reissue or get a Deluxe Reverb reissue. Those used to be $1,000 or less, especially used. With COVID, everything's gone up. So those are $900 to $1,400 used, and a little bit more than that new. So that's a shame. But, it used to be I'd put those on there. And the reissue Princeton Fenders, the 65 reissue Fenders are quite good amps, not the 68 customs and not the 64 customs and all that. But the 65 Princeton Reverb, 65 Deluxe Reverb, those reissues, the Super and the Twin, you can get incredible deals on those. You can also get incredible deals on 70s Supers and Twins because no one wants the weight or to ship them. You can pick them up $700-800, get them restored for $200 to $400, and have an amp that would cost $4,000 to build today and sound like it. It's the guy who plays two rock would be fine on a restored 74 Super Reverb.
Yeah,
you might have $1,100 in.
Yeah, the 70s Fenders I always thought were sleepers for today's amps because they sort of check all the boxes of things that people would want. They're hand-wired still. There's some differences obviously between the mid 60s sort of golden era Fenders, but those are easy conversions to do for the most part. And the aesthetics are slightly different, but the everything on Fenders is pretty moddable, fixable. If you don't like the speakers they used in the 70s, those are pretty easy to get comparable speakers to what would have been used in the original stuff, whether that be a Alnico Jensen or a CTS or whatever.
You got a 76 Super right here.
Yeah.
Sounds phenomenal.
They're fantastic. They're fantastic. And you can also get the faceplate if you really want it to look like a mid-60s
I'm not a big fan
Fender.
of that myself, but it is possible. Yeah.
Some people they want to go all the way with their with the mods. So to recap that, Lyle, if you would say sort of best amps from 1,000 on down to 500, you have the Marshall. What was the model number?
The DSL 40C and CR. Now that's not the best Marshall, and that's not the best amp. But if you want a tube amp that has clean, dirty effects loop, for your cover band gig, your church gig, but you don't want to go into the modeling thing, that's a really good option. Now, when I publish those, people are always like, well, what about this? What about that? What about this? What about that? And there are people who either had a sample size of one of a model where I routinely run into the same problem every time, but theirs had not exhibited that yet. Or people who were going off what they remember things costing. Man, I got me a Vibro Champ for $400. When? In 1984? It just, that's not the reality of today. But people, if you don't keep up with the market, you have a weird sense of what things actually cost.
Yeah.
And so you get weird recommendations. There are other amps under 1,000. Some of the Trainer Bassmasters can be had for $600-700 if you have a cabinet to go with it. Phenomenal amp. And there are old Peavey solid states that can be great choices. The trouble, as I said in the video with the old Peavey solid states, is that Peavey is almost defunct. They used to be a great company, and they had a world-class parts department. So if you had a Peavey from 1978 and they used a chip that hadn't been made since 1982. They had those chips. You could get those chips. You could fix that amp, keep it going. That parts department has either been shut down or is in the last stages of that. And so a lot of the transistors used in the 70s and 80s, you cannot get. And to get 2 working ones, I'd have to buy 20 off eBay. Hopefully they're not fakes, and then sort through all those to find 2 that might work. And so cost of long-term ownership is a consideration for the older amps.
Wow.
Yeah. What do you think about, this is sort of an aside, like the Peavey, the tube amps that they were making sort of in the 80s, and they had those like MDF speaker enclosures and
God, those things are so heavy. I mean, like the VTMs and all that stuff.
There was one
where the MDF was that thick.
Yeah, like even the heads weighed, like 100-watt head was like 50, 60 pounds, maybe more.
And the cab is most of that. Yeah.
Like the Mace or like things like that.
Yeah. The VTM stuff was actually good. It was just built really fragilely. Kim Thayil from Soundgarden did his first record or 2 with one of those and sounded fantastic. The trouble with those is they had all these dip switches, and it's like you could find fantastic settings, which were pretty much just that of a 1987, 1959 circuit, or you could make it sound horrible and just little dip switches that broke. But Peavey has had some really great amps and some really weird amps. But with any of these things, there's the subjective and there's the objective. Like, you can have your favorite amp in the world, and the next guy's going to say, that's okay.
Yeah.
Or I don't care for that. I try to stay away from the subjective stuff in my reviews. I'm like, hey, it doesn't work for me. This would be great for a certain style player. I can tell you if it's going to catch on fire. I can tell you if the tube sockets are kind of desolder themselves, et cetera, et cetera. If the input jacks were never tightened from the factory. So within the realm of the well-built and the safe bet, anything else is subjective. Above $1,000 today, you get into some really nice stuff. But below $1,000, and you have to remember that today's $1,000 is the $500 of 7-8 years ago.
Yeah.
So everyone who's been doing this for a while has to adjust to that. Oh wow, I can't get that anywhere for cheap. I used to be able to get a made in Japan Strat for $600 everywhere. I see them on eBay now in Reverb for $2,400. I've owned them. They're not $2,400 guitars. They're, in my mind, they're still $400 to $600. Great, I'll grab that, take it for that other gig. That's not how the world works anymore.
Yeah. Now, if you were to go up in price point, we were to say, let's go between 1,000 to 2,000. How would your recommendations change for that price point of amp and what's really a great buy at that level?
Well, it always depends on what your needs are and what your preferences are. So the guy who's playing metal is not going to be happy with an AC30.
Mm-hmm.
Except for clean overdubs, he'd be thrilled. The guy who's playing country would not be very happy with maybe a Friedman Dirty Shirley, though it actually has a pretty nice clean sound. So you gotta have a real good sense of what you want and how loud you need to be. I find that amateurs tend to have very low wattage amps because that's what they can afford. Real pros tend to have very low wattage amps because they're using really great monitoring and in-ear monitors and all that. And they're not viewing the amplifier as an amplifier so much as a tone generator. Mm-hmm. It's the guys in the middle who will show up to a small gig on a Tuesday night with a 4x12 and a 50-watt Marshall and then complain that he's being told to turn down. The days of 50-watt and 100-watt Marshalls being played live, unless you are in a massive venue, are pretty much behind us. And people need to understand that the difference between a 30-watt amp and a 50-watt amp is the same as the difference between a 50-watt and a 100-watt amp is the same difference between a 30-watt and a 15-watt, or just doubling your speakers. So you can have a deluxe reverb, and for large gigs, you bring in another 2x12 cab, run into it, and you're almost at pro reverb levels.
Wow.
So a lot of what I do is customer education, client education, before we even get into anything else. Beyond that, Friedman makes really good stuff. Sir makes really good stuff. Germino, I'm not sure if you can get those under 2,000. Fantastic. Okay. Top Hat is a really good company. Swart, if you need low voltage stuff, if you're okay with it being 5 to 8 watts, phenomenal build quality on a Swart. There are other companies I will not mention that are not specifically great. Here comes your baby.
Yes.
Hello.
We'll start with him in the cage. He just started walking, so we've got
Awesome.
got our hands full. Yeah. So the Swart for low voltage.
Oh, low wattage, yeah.
Low wattage, yeah.
And it's a very loud 5 watts because they put a Celestian blue in it. You know, you could use it at a lot of gigs where people would use a Princeton set clean. But, you know, I'm trying not to crap on any particular companies. At the same time, I'd rather point towards the good stuff, but people are always like, what about this? What about that? You know, in general, like modern Orange are good sounding amps without any real glaring problems, except that they insist on using these really poorly made potentiometers with really long dish shafts or really long split shafts. And you can't, if that pot fails and those pots, the shaft just snaps off if you breathe on it too hard, you can only get, really, to do it properly, you have to get an Orange pot, particularly if it's one of the dual gangs that they use. And then they have this really long, fragile pot shaft that's a split knurled shaft that they put set screw knobs on. I don't understand why Orange insists on giving them all the same Achilles heel. Yeah. Marshall has some really good amps and some terrible amps. For instance, this is not a popular opinion. I get critiqued for this all the time. The SV, the Studio Vintage thing, that's $1,900, is built exactly the same way as the Origin 20, which is like an $900 amp. And no one can explain why you're paying $1,000 extra for the same build quality. Neither one of them sounds like a real Marshall. Neither one is a Marshall-esque circuit. It's not anything they've ever done. The Origin is especially removed from their heritage. They don't sound great if you compare them to what they're impersonating. They look fantastic. But for the Studio Vintage 20, it looks like a Plexi. It costs like a Plexi. It doesn't sound like one. The Origin kind of looks the same way, and it's a weird circuit where they put the plate follower stuff and how they do the effects loop is just all backwards. You know, the Vox AC15C, the AC30C, the AC15 and 30, the Handwired, great amps. The AC10C1 is terrible, and people don't believe me because they buy it. A lot of times it's probably their first tube amp, and they want to love it, so they love it. And then I say, well, that thing's really got some glaring problems, both as a tech and as a player. They just give me hate.
I'm curious. So I'm actually curious because you just mentioned Vox.
Mm-hmm.
I've had a lot of AC30s, and the most recent one I had is the AC30, the C2.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had some people do like, what do you think about we don't carry Vox at the store, but people were like, what do you think about the C2? And I've loved them, but I'm wondering from like your perspective, like I think it's like what 14. I just had someone talking to. I was talking to Seal. Seal's one of my clients, and he has a bunch of old vintage Vox amps. And he's like, "Well, what does a AC30 run these days?" And I was like, "I think it's like $1,500 or something." And but I remember getting my C2 for like $500 pre-COVID, but now they're like used like $1,200. And I'm like, I really want to get a C2 back, but I'm like, I'm curious. You know, I'm curious of your thoughts. Are they built like? Are they well built for the C2?
They're extremely well built for the price point.
Okay.
For those who don't know these things, most consumers, most guitarists lump tube amps into Handwired and PCB.
Yeah.
And those are hard and fast things. Handwired is great, PCB is bad. There are Handwired amps that were handwired by idiots. You know, handwired. Whose hands? Is the design good? And there are PCBs that are made to be cheap to produce and get out in great numbers, and there are PCBs designed to be rugged and to sound good. If you buy a Sur, you're getting really good PCB. If you buy a Germino, you're buying really good hand wiring. A lot of the amps in the sub $2,000 price range use PCBs, and many of them use really poor PCBs. The signs of a good PCB are about 2 millimeter thick or more boards, thick traces, top and bottom, through hole plated, a lot of copper on there, where the traces are run intelligently and things aren't going to short and arc. And so if you buy the Sur, you buy the Friedman, the PCB series, that's what you're getting. Those guys have been designing this stuff for a while, John especially. You get a great implementation, and every one he makes is built to the same standard and will sound like the next one, given variations in tubes and speakers and players. But you get a cheap PCB, it goes out the window. The Vox is extremely well built for the price point. It's a very thick, double-sided, through-hole plated PCB. The traces are mostly run intelligently. When I get an AC15 or 30C, which is not the CC, not the Custom Classic, but the Custom Series, I bump up the screen grids to 1Ks, and I do some changes to the tone stacks to make them a little bit more like the original JMI eras. And I'll give everyone a point. If you got one of these on the normal channel, there's a 330K resistor. I think it's R1 in series before the volume pot on the gain channel. That just neuters that channel. Jump over that 330K, see what you think. You'll like it.
Wow.
The only real problems the AC30C2 has, and it doesn't affect all of them, there's a place on the output board where they have some quick connects that go to the primaries of the output transformer. And those traces and those pads are run very, very closely to the grid traces, and occasionally you'll get an arc there. And so if an amp has that, or if an owner wants me to preemptively fix that, I'll take my Dremel and cut a little channel there and cut that bit of the grid away from the plate connection, and then I'll run a little bit of wire. Just, they need to revise that board addition in later runs. Hopefully they will. It doesn't happen very often, but it can happen. That's about the only systemic thing I've run into with those amps.
Gotcha.
And that's an easy fix.
Yeah.
I want to keep talking about some of these, amplifiers, but I wanted to break for just a moment to talk about a couple of sponsors that make the podcast possible every single week. The first of which is the Guitar Sanctuary. And if you're not aware, Brian is actually sitting in the Guitar Sanctuary right now. He loves it so much. And if you're considering having a custom pedal board built, Brian offers these services through the Guitar Sanctuary. Not only is he building custom rigs, but they have every imaginable guitar, amplifier, and pedal that you may need to build the rig of your dreams. Head over to theguitarsanctuary.com and check out their offerings, everything from high-end boutique to Fender, Gibson, etc. They have it all. Also, I would like to talk about Sweetwater and their Gear Exchange. This is a new program that Sweetwater has launched that sort of is a hybrid between what you would find on Craigslist, eBay, and Reverb, where it is a platform where you can sell used gear peer-to-peer. The coolest thing, though, about the Gear Exchange is that you can save on seller fees if you decide to take all of your earnings and place them on a Sweetwater gift card. You don't have to pay any seller fees whatsoever. And if you're somebody like me who's routinely buying stuff from Sweetwater, it's a great way to keep all of the money that you earn by selling all of your used gear. Go to sweetwater.com/used. You can set up an account for free. I'm selling some stuff right now, an old TC Electronics Chorus, a few other old pedals that I don't use anymore. Really, really cool stuff. I highly recommend that you check out Sweetwater's Gear Exchange. Lastly, Neural DSP. Now, for those of you who are into the modeling thing, and we've touched on it slightly in this podcast, the Neural DSP stuff is really, really interesting and advanced in this space, in my opinion, if you're going to go the modeling route. The Quad Cortex is an absolute powerhouse, has a lot of great sounds in it and a lot of great models. But beyond that, one piece that I use quite a bit from Neural is their plugins. Often when I'm starting a video or I need to kind of brainstorm some sounds, here with Oakley, my 1-year-old son, we'll often go into the Quad Cortex, get some sounds there, but then we'll head over to the plugins and I'll check out my Mark II C Plus plugin, my Corey Wong plugin, get some good clean sounds, get some good dirty sounds. and kind of use that to maybe outline or map sounds that I want to get later with my tube amps. I really love it. And Neural DSP is offering 30% off any of their plugins to Chairman of the Board's listeners. Use the discount code Chairman, CHAIRMEN. Get 30% off any plugin that they offer, except any new releases. And then those will be available 90 days after the release for the same discount. All right. Those were our sponsors. So let's go back to Lyle. So to recap, we've talked about a little bit on PCB versus hand wiring in this last section, and we've touched a little bit on some of the higher price point amps. I'm wondering if Lyle, we can maybe spend a little bit of time or a little more time on the PCB versus hand wiring, because this is something that I think a lot of people misunderstand, and there's a lot of evangelists of the hand wiring dogma, let's say, and they can't get away from the idea that an amp couldn't possibly be built well because it was built on a PCB. I think namely because their experience has been with poor quality PCBs, and they've kind of painted PCBs with a broad brush to say that I had a bad experience with my $500 PCB amp, and or even Marshalls. Some of the transitional Marshalls had some challenges as they were kind of trying to convert their designs from hand-wired amps to PCBs. But I've also seen amplifiers that I've worked on that are supposedly hand-wired, but then when you lift up the board where all the turrets are, that there's like a mess of spaghetti wiring underneath.
Yeah,
and
I've got one on my channel that people love and hate to watch. Yeah, I get as much equal hate and love on it, on a Morgan PR12, and underneath it is just spaghetti fest. Yeah, it looks great if you're not looking beneath the board.
Yeah, and that leads to, as you were mentioning, tons of inconsistencies, because lead lengths, especially in certain stages of the amp, can have a really, really drastic change in how things sound if you're using additional wire. As you said, like, who's hand wiring it? If Dolores, goes on her smoke break and pulls, an extra, an extra 10 inches, of wire between, a critical gain stage, this could be a really different sounding amp and really noisy.
Everyone's heard about Friday amps. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Here's the first thing I want people to remember. Every Ampeg SVT you've ever heard, starting in 1969, is PCB. Every Marshall, with the exception of some recent hand-wired reissues, starting about 1972, has been PCB. So if you've enjoyed an album using any Marshall made after 1972, so that's Moving Pictures, that's Exit Stage Left, that's Physical Graffiti, it's all these things that people just look up to. Oh, that's the sound. Those are all PCB Marshalls. And an interesting thing about PCB design and those 70s and early 80s Marshalls is that the boards are single-sided with not a lot of copper on them. And if a bad tech is working on them, they will get really messed up really fast on the bottom. And the buyer won't necessarily see that unless the board is lifted. I've seen so many underneath there that have just been butchered because people are just yanking on stuff. But it can be done correctly. But what Marshall did that was really smart is that all the things which get hot in the amp are not on the PCB. All the screen resistors are on the tube sockets. The only thing which sometimes goes wrong on those amps is that causes damage is the dropping resistors, the 10Ks, the 20Ks, the big 2 and 3 watt dropping resistors. Sometimes can cause a little bit of board damage. It's pretty rare. Those things don't generate that much heat when everything's healthy. Fender in their modern reissue series, say a 65 Deluxe Reverb reissue, that board is built the same way as Marshall built theirs back in the day, but Fender put some of the components which get hot on the PCB, and so you have a less rugged of a design as a result. So when a client brings one of those in, I'll move the screen grid resistors and the heater stuff off the PCB and put it where Fender had it back in the 60s and 70s, where the heat is taken care of. So it's possible to make even less high-quality PCBs work as long as everything is done fairly well. If I were to build you an amp, Mason, if I were to build just one amp and I did the whole thing, I could do a turret, I could do an eyelet, and I wire everything by hand. And I'm like, okay, I need exactly that much wire to get from this eyelet to pin 2 of this tube, but I need to have another 1/2 inch just to keep some slack here, and then I want to run along the bottom of the chassis for a bit of shielding, then go up. So that wire is going to be that long, and then when it's dressed, it's that long. And then I have all these wires here attached to that tube. I'll go in there and I'll move them around and find the distance between them. And if I move this wire here, the hum from the heaters goes away, et cetera, et cetera. I can lock everything in. It may take me an hour plus per amp to get everything laid out just so. And then I build one for you, Brian, and I've got to do the whole thing. And I may forget what I did that first time that made the buzz go away.
Mm-hmm.
A really good amp designer kind of does that first thing. It says, this is where everything should be with wires. This is working. This is great. And then they kind of take a snapshot of that and they replicate that in a PCB. So you make the first amp, you take that snapshot, you build a PCB where all the traces are running the exact same way, and then you make one, you sell it to Mason. Make another one, sell it to Brian. They're the same amp at that point, and you can make 1,000 of them, and you don't have to spend that hour fine-tuning per amp because you have done all that experimenting in the design stage, and then you replicate that. If you look at a John Suhr amp, if you know what you're looking at, he has everything within one triode stage all together. So here's always fighting where things are on this end. So here's the first input stage triode, and here's the second triode, here's the third triode, here's the fourth triode, and all of them are grounded to the cathode, and those cathodes go to the filter cap negative for that stage. And you can see all the traces, and he will use the advantage that PCB can offer and say, all right, I'm going to run some traces that are just connected to ground here to shield this grid trace from everything else. So you're building in shielding into the board. And not doing just random ground planes, but steering everything and making sure that, all right, if the signal comes in and it goes to ground, it doesn't just go to ground to everything. It goes to ground to here, and it flows through the entire amp the way you want it to do. So PCB offers a really good designer, and I'd say John is certainly a great example, the opportunities to do what you cannot really do with a hand-wired amp unless you have a much larger space. You can do almost anything you want in a high watt. A high watt is a huge, huge thing, and there's tons of real estate. You try to do all that in a smaller amp.
They don't take advantage, though, of a lot of the space in the high watt.
No, a high watt is just that big to hold the tubes and the transformers, the circuits,
right.
the size of a lunchbox for less.
Right.
But